Hello, everyone. As promised, this is going to be lecture 9, our final lecture. And I'm going to put up the PDF of the slides like I always do. You'll find those on Ames as well. Of course, you found this video link. It's going to cover basically Vietnam and its consequences and what we'll kind of call the collapse of the liberal consensus. But let me go through this. All right, so here's a little introduction for us.
Hi, my name is Uhuru Williams. I'm a historian, and here are some things you need to know in order to sound smart about the Vietnam War protests. The Vietnam War remains one of the most controversial military engagements in United States history. It was an unpopular war at the time due to several factors. First and foremost, the United States had not clearly articulated its objectives in Vietnam. Secondly, there was no clear declaration of war. Media coverage of the Vietnam War also turned public opinion at home. The daily body counts provided by news anchors on the three major networks alerted Americans to the fact that the Vietnam conflict might very well be unwinnable. Anti-Vietnam War protests actually began as a relatively small movement among intellectuals in small circles on college campuses prior to 1965. It wasn't until the war escalated in 1965 that the widespread anti-Vietnam War protests that most Americans are familiar with became prominent. The largest and most famous of the anti-Vietnam War protests took place in October of 1967, when more than 100,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to protest the war in Vietnam. One of the darkest chapters in the anti-war protests that occurred during this period took place in 1970 at Kent State, when a group of National Guardsmen fired into a group of student protesters, killing 4. Anti-Vietnam War protests gained even more ground in December of 1969 when the federal government instituted the first draft lottery, the first of its kind since World War II. This led many young men to flee to Canada to avoid conscription. By 1973, all of these had the cumulative effect of forcing the Nixon administration to rethink its Vietnam policy. And in that year, Nixon effectively announced the end of the Vietnam War. Young people in large numbers came out.
All right, so the Vietnam War, Students for Democratic Society and the New Left, the anti-war movement, and the end of the Vietnam War. My early childhood, meaning all the way through elementary school, basically was shadowed in a lot of ways by the Vietnam War, as well as the Cold War that took place. I mean, when I was growing up, we had tornado drills for my elementary school, junior high, and high school, but we also had nuclear war drills, like what to do if there was a nuclear attack. And so, I mean, that was part of it. Plus, I remember the Vietnam War. My older brothers and sisters were, some of them kind of involved in the anti-war protests. So it was something that I just recall from that time very distinctly. And at that time, it was the longest war, or shall we say military action, that the US had been involved in. Of course, now with the Afghanistan war, that would be almost twice as long. So after World War II, Vietnam, which had been a colony of France, sought independence. The Vietnamese had fought against the Japanese occupation during the war, World War II, and so after the war, like a lot of colonies, for the British and for the French and others, they were demanding their independence. However, France, for a variety of political reasons, most of them domestic, wanted to maintain its colonies. They didn't want to give them up. And so the war, as far as Vietnamese were concerned, went on. They're not fighting the Japanese anymore. Now they are fighting the French. And it did not go well for the French. They were not prepared for the type of warfare that the Vietnamese were engaging in. And so literally through the 1950s, basically France was looking for an opportunity to get out of Vietnam with some sort of, I guess, face saving. After World War II, there was a renewed effort for independence. The Vietnamese actually sought US support, but there were dynamics of the Cold War that caused the Truman administration and later the Eisenhower administration to hesitate supporting the Vietnamese in this endeavor. We felt, meaning the United States, needed the support of France, and France was not willing to give that support. They were always threatening to kind of go off on their own in a way, if they were not allowed to maintain their colonies. So it was, again, some of it was an international political perspective of prestige, but also it was the dynamics of the homegrown politics in France. But things did not work out for the French. 1954, Vietnam finally was divided into communist North Vietnam and anti-communist South Vietnam. That was kind of the temporary solution when the French were pulling out. And the agreement was that later there would be a plebiscite and there would be a vote, and then the Vietnamese themselves could decide what type of government they wanted. That, of course, did not happen. We'd go on 20 more years and the Vietnam would still be split. 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. I mentioned this a little bit. It was basically an attack, or at least a supposed attack, on an American ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, which was a Vietnamese area. And we know now that it was probably just staged. It was used as an excuse. But what the Johnson administration, the presidential administration of President Johnson, got out of the Tonkin Gulf was a Tonkin Gulf resolution, which basically handed over the right to engage in warfare in Vietnam to the President of the United States on behalf of the American people and the Congress. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution basically was the start of the shooting war for the United States in 1964. Now, as early as 1962, there was an organization called Students for Democratic Society, SDS. And they had what they called the Port Huron Statement, which was a criticism of American politics, society, consumerism, and the Cold War. I mean, early 1960s, a lot of the emphasis was on civil rights and issues that people saw with the lack of rights that different disadvantaged groups in the United States had, whether African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, people with diverse sexual orientations, those sorts of situations. So it would later become, as the war began for the United States in Vietnam, it would also switch over to a definite strong anti-Vietnam intervention. That would kind of become their main organizing principles, that they were anti-war, they were anti-Vietnam involvement, they wanted out of the Vietnam War. The initial efforts, basically by Students for Democratic Society, SDS, was to organize communities in the inner city specifically. Protests of link between the US Capitol and, for example, South Africa's apartheid regime. By the way, the apartheid regime of South Africa was a formal official system of segregation that the South Africa had at the time. Even though Africans predominated, meaning Black Africans predominated in numbers in South Africa by huge margin, the real power was always held by a smaller group of Afrikaans, of white Africans, basically. And so that was the situation. So they focused on that. It was part of the civil rights movement, but they didn't want the US dealing with South Africa and helping to bolster that country's apartheid system. Apartheid, think of apart, that's basically what it is. Okay, then the Berkeley Free Speech Movement demanded rights to political speech on campus. At that time, and before that time, students didn't have full right of free speech. And this is even on the university campus. The governing bodies of universities could actually effectively get rid of students, for example, who were protesting or saying things that the university did not believe in. People could be expelled, that sort of thing. So one of the arguments was, listen, we need to have free speech. We are on college students, yes, but we are, well, if you're 18 at that time, adults, and so we have the right to protest, to make statements, to have free speech. And the movement questioned the mission of higher education itself. This also boosted SDS nationally. You know, what was the mission of higher education? Was it to develop people into free thinkers? Was it to develop you know, good citizens? I mean, it's still a debate, right? So anyway, this was definitely part of the Berkeley free speech movement, demanding that we rethink what's happening on college campuses, that we allow college students, young scholars, to have free speech, and that they should not be adversely impacted if the governing bodies of the universities that they're attending disagree with what the students are saying. Then we also had something called the New Left. Now, it was a broad intellectual and political movement. It rejected kind of the old left, which you could think of as socialists or communists, liberal Democrats, people coming out of the 1930s, 1940s. Sought instead, it did, greater democratic participation in all areas of life. Out of this era, we would get the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. So, you know, the government was responding. Lyndon Johnson, I think his presidency was overshadowed, as it should have been, by the Vietnam conflict. It was. It basically drove him out of power ultimately. But his presidency was significant on the domestic front for a lot of things he did. Civil rights movement, Voting Right Act, Medicare, lots of things out of the Great Society system actually benefited people. I think where historians are looking at that now more so what he attempted to accomplish in his presidency on the domestic level. He definitely did not do well as far as Vietnam. 1960s movement towards greater cultural freedoms, rejected styles, values, behaviors, and consumerism of earlier generations. If you think of the hippies, that's kind of what encapsulates the whole view of this. Wanting to get away from the traditional system of societal organization, you know, where you got the dad going off to work, the mom stays home with the kids, you live in the suburbs, you this, that, the other thing. So there was a movement towards trying to have more freedom in personal life as well. And we would later see in the 70s, we later see in the late 60s, you know, also when we talk about other groups, whether it be the women's movement or the rights of gay Americans being emphasized. So we'd see a lot of different groups, as well as for example, the American Indian movement and that. So there would be efforts to try to rectify biases, try to change biases, try to change the way society has its expectations put on certain individuals and groups. That would be all part of this movement towards greater cultural freedoms. And Mario Savio addresses the crowd, Berkeley free speech movement. So 1964, as you can see, I mean, it was, you know, people took this seriously. It was kind of a decade of protests in a way. True, a lot of the protesting were done by university students, primarily Caucasian university students, but we also see other groups represented in this as well. Student occupation of Hamilton Hall, Columbia University. So this became something that would be done. Students to protest and actually go and occupy one of the buildings on campus, usually an administrative building, and you know, the kind of to make their message known to the public. As you can see, they're kind of having a standoff there with the police. And the anti-war movement, we saw Vietnam War was opposed by civil rights and Black Power organizations. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, was opposed to the Vietnam War, and that was consistent. The civil rights and Black Power organizations, they also looked at who was being drafted into the war, who was going to fight the war. It tended to be people from lower socioeconomic levels, Disproportionately, it was also African Americans. Famously, Muhammad Ali, the boxer, had been called Cassius Clay, actually protested, refused to go into the military to go to Vietnam. As he said famously, I have no quarrel with the Viet Cong. And then he suffered because of that decision, because he was not allowed to fight professionally for a number of years, actually. Okay, so 1965, SDS organized anti-war rally in Washington, D.C., nationally recognized as a leader to student anti-war movement, that organization was. There was a rapid influx of new SDS members attracted by the anti-war message. Now, you have to realize, too, that nowadays, at this time, we had television. And so, speeches, protests, and that would be televised. People would want to have reporters and TV cameras at their events of protest, because then they could, get their message out to the hinterlands, to everyone in the country, no matter where they lived. Okay. And so seeing that, of course, encouraged students, more people who wanted to join SDS then. And they also linked the Vietnam War to other Cold War interventions. They were critical of American support for undemocratic anti-communist regimes, which was a very legitimate complaint. The US had a tendency to support dictators, as long as those dictators were decidedly not communist. For example, Pinochet in Chile. I mean, Nixon, basically, well, he used a slur, but he said, that guy, he might be a so-and-so, but he's our so-and-so. In other words, I don't care what he's doing domestically to his people. He's anti-communist, so we want him. And this happened over and over again. The same thing in Iran, the Shah of Iran, all sorts of occasions when the US actually occasionally would put down democratically inclined social changes in these countries around the world, because they were worried that they might lead to socialism or communism, and would favor instead maybe a strongman, a dictator who was, for all of his faults, was at least willing to declare he was not communist and fight against the communists. 1968, 100,000 anti-war protesters held a rally in Washington, D.C. So 65, we had an anti-war rally in Washington, D.C., one of the early ones. 68, things are really, really getting hot, shall we say. So 1968, protests turned violent outside the Democratic National Convention, actually, which was being held in Chicago. There were protests and that, because remember, the Democrats at that time were actually in power. Even though Lyndon Johnson had announced he would not seek re-election, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was going to run. And so people were protesting against the Democratic convention, because the Democrats at that time were in power, and they identified them, the protesters did, with the Vietnam War. 1969, SDS split, and then there was a decline in its influence. By 1968, so many things were going on. I mean, there were riots. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Malcolm X had been assassinated a couple of years prior. It was a violent time. And I still remember my father putting me on his shoulders. I was a young kid at that stage, and showing me the skyline of Detroit, and I could see the flames. I could see the flames from the protests, and the burning, and the riots. It was a difficult time. So 1967, there were constant protests by this stage with American involvement in the Vietnam War. People who were in my brothers and sisters, older brothers and sisters, graduating high school classes were being drafted later and going into the war. Many of them did not come back, or some of them came back, but seriously wounded, both physically maybe, and also psychologically. By 1969, the Vietnam War increasingly was unpopular. Media, again, because we had television, media showed the brutality of the war. There'd be something called the My Lai massacre, and then a cover-up of that massacre. I'll talk a little bit about the My Lai massacre, a little video for you too. It occurred in Vietnam, where hundreds of civilians were killed, men, women, and children, by US troops. And then we had the Kent State incident in 1970, where the National Guard fired into a crowd of protesting university students and killed 4 of them. Nixon, by this time, President Nixon had become president. He was elected in the election of 1968. The Democrats didn't stand much of a chance, but as I mentioned, he did introduce something called the Southern Strategy, which was an effort to kind of get the racist old South that had traditionally voted Democratic to support the Republicans. And now if you go to the South, if you go to Mississippi, if you go to Alabama, you go to these areas, generally the power structure politically is held by the Republican Party. Okay, this goes way back to that election of the Southern Strategy. And there are all sorts of elements of the Southern Strategy, introducing law and order, an anti-drug policy, all sorts of things, efforts to break up the war protests, all of that as part of the Republican agenda under Nixon in his effort to kind of get the traditional, racist or for, groups that had traditionally voted Democratic. He wanted them to vote Republican, and they did. And they still generally vote Republican outside of the urban centers in the South. The urban centers in the South, as of late, have turned more blue, shall we say, which is they're supporting the Democratic Party more. Vietnamization was the transfer of the conduct of war to South Vietnam, to the South Vietnamese army. That was ultimately the goal, that we'd hand off the war effort to the South Vietnamese army, give it military assistance, help train its soldiers, and hopefully it will be able to stand on its own. Did it? Not really at all. 1972, there was a negotiated ceasefire. 1973, the withdrawal of U.S. forces began in earnest. By 1975, there was a victory by North Vietnam. I mean, when the U.S. really turned over the war effort to the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, it did not carry over well. The North Vietnamese, the communists, invaded the South. They were able to overrun Saigon. There are famous pictures of people trying desperately to get on these helicopters to go off to American ships off the coast. But there was a victory by North Vietnam. It was a demoralizing defeat for the U.S. that contributed to the dissatisfaction with the Cold War, caused issues in the U.S. Now, Nixon, he was known for his foreign policy acumen. He had been a vice president under Eisenhower, so he understood diplomacy. He'd been on the international stage for a very long time. Like, I guess, President Biden, who spent 8 years as vice president and is kind of getting known for his ability in the international sphere of diplomacy. Being vice president is pretty good preparation to be president because you have met all these world leaders. You are used to being on that type of stage, and you kind of have an idea of realpolitik probably. So here, let's listen to President Nixon's Cold War strategy.
I have served 7 American presidents of both parties, Republican and Democrat, beginning with President John F. Kennedy and ending with President Bill Clinton. Although I have great admiration for the leaders I have served, none have thought so strategically about foreign policy as President Richard Nixon. My name is Winston Lord. I served as the 3rd U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China, the State Department Director of Policy Planning, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. In the Nixon White House, I was the principal assistant to Dr. Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council. I was with the President and National Security Advisor in virtually every major diplomatic event that took place during the administration. Let me give you a snapshot of what the world looked like at the time. By the late 1960s, the United States military had committed over 500,000 troops to fight in the jungles of Vietnam. By 1968, nearly 60,000 Americans and over 2 million Vietnamese on both sides were killed. Both casualties and domestic protests were mounting. The war in Vietnam was presenting the United States with a credibility problem at home and abroad, and with both allies and enemies alike. In addition, we had mutual hostility and no contact with 1/5 of humanity. We were in a tense standoff with the Soviet Union, which was rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal. Much of the Middle East was under the influence of Soviet arms. At home, there were turmoil and division, with demonstrations against the Vietnam War, racial strife, and assassination of national leaders. As Nixon was gearing up for the 1968 presidential campaign, he urged Americans to think more dynamically about Asia in an influential article he wrote in the October 1967 edition of Foreign Affairs magazine called Asia After Vietnam. He said, quote, "A small country on the tip of the continent has filled the screen of our minds, but it does not fill the map," he wrote. Meanwhile, in 1968, the Soviet Union was enforcing compliance to its Warsaw Pact when it rolled Soviet tanks into Czechoslovakia and lined up several divisions along the Ussuri River border with the People's Republic of China. Facing this challenging landscape, Nixon and Kissinger began carrying out a strategic approach on foreign policy. They sought to end the Vietnam War on an honorable basis by seeking a peace agreement through secret negotiations and strengthening South Vietnamese forces to take over combat while American forces withdrew. At the same time, they resisted North Vietnamese pressures. With the help of American air cover, the South Vietnamese army defended its homeland against an all-out onslaught from the Soviet-backed North Vietnamese army in the spring of 1972. Meanwhile, the administration moved to make progress with both communist giants, the Soviet Union and China. Always thinking like a chess master, several steps ahead, President Nixon wrote to Dr. Kissinger just 10 days into the administration to explore possibilities of rapprochement with the Chinese. Nixon felt that if he achieved an opening with the Chinese, this would spur flexibility from a concerned Soviet Union. He would be able to seize on division within the communist bloc and achieve better relations with both countries than they had with each other. In addition, Nixon sought, in breaking ground in triangular diplomacy, to isolate Hanoi from its two biggest patrons. He also sought to stabilize Asia and show that American diplomacy was not hamstrung by the Vietnam War. After 2 years of talking to China through various secret channels, a breakthrough occurred via Pakistan and the curious tale of the U.S. ping pong team being invited to China. As a result of Kissinger's secret visit to Beijing, President Nixon shocked the world on July 15, 1971, by announcing that he would be the first president to visit the People's Republic of China.
Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure.
Moscow, after hearing the news of the China opening, agreed to an immediate summit and moved toward pacts on arms control and Berlin. Nixon's February 1972 trip was truly the week that changed the world, connecting America to 1/5 of the world's people after nearly a quarter century of mutual isolation and enmity. Symbolically, he shook hands with Premier Zhou Enlai upon arriving in China. At the end of that historic trip, Nixon and the Chinese leadership issued the joint Shanghai Communique. This unique document candidly expressed differences between the two nations, which gave credibility to the areas where they did converge, including balancing the Soviet Union. While the U.S. and China had major differences and worldviews, They postponed tough obstacles so as to launch a new relationship. China's leadership sought ties with a country separated by 3,000 miles of ocean to balance their communist neighbor from whom they were facing security threats. In brief, while each side stated its differences outright, they both agreed on general principles that would guide peaceful relations moving forward. The two sides stated an ambiguous one China policy, with the U.S. government acknowledging that Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait adhere to this principle. Meanwhile, the U.S. maintained diplomatic relations and a defense treaty with Taiwan. In May 1972, Nixon visited Moscow, where he negotiated the strategic arms limitation talks, which resulted in multiple agreements, including the anti-ballistic missile treaty. The two sides agreed in principle to a treaty that limited each to only one missile launching site and 100 interceptor missiles. The United States and the Soviet Union were limited to defending just a small fraction of their respective lands, and thus kept both subject to the deterrent effect of the other's strategic weapons. They also put a cap on offensive missiles where Moscow had been outpacing Washington. This marked the beginning of an era of détente, or easing of tensions, with the two great superpowers. While it wasn't an end to all Soviet pressure, it put the relationship on a more stable basis and paved the way for successor administrations eventually to win the Cold War.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By the end of 1972, the Nixon-Kissinger team were 3 for 3. America opened relations with China, achieved arms control and détente with the Soviet Union, and ended the Vietnam War and brought all American POWs home. South Vietnam fell to Hanoi's invasion in 1975, though the accord had given them every chance to succeed. If it weren't for the shameful actions of Congress to deny Saigon much-needed military and economic aid, as the Soviets supplied for Hanoi, the fate of Vietnam might well have had a different outcome. During his second administration, the Watergate scandal proved, of course, to be an immense distraction from the president's policy agenda, and then removed him from office. There was still much to be done, including strengthening alliances and starting negotiations in the Middle East. Despite the growing scandal, progress was made on the latter. Much to the world's surprise, on October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against America's ally, Israel. Egyptian tanks crossed the Suez Canal, and the Israeli Defense Forces incurred significant losses. Nixon saw a chance for American diplomacy, but knew that our friend Israel needed further military support. Many in the American bureaucracy thought that shipping arms to Israel would be provocative to the Arabs. Nixon overrode their concerns and ordered an immediate airlift of war materials to the Jewish state. Quote, "Send them everything that can fly," Nixon ordered his national security advisor, Dr. Kissinger. Israeli Defense Forces were able to recover their losses and surrounded the Egyptian Third Army near the Suez Canal. Where Nixon saw crisis, he also saw opportunity. He sent Kissinger abroad to freeze the battlefield situation. Israel was sobered by its initial setback. Egypt had not suffered a humiliating defeat. Thus, both sides were prepared to negotiate. The Israelis and Egyptians agreed to a ceasefire under the aegis of an American-Soviet agreement. While Nixon insisted on UN peacekeepers to enforce the agreement, the Soviets were eager to send in their own troops. Nixon immediately ordered U.S. forces to DEFCON 3, a state of increased military readiness. The Soviets backed down. The stage for further diplomacy was now set. All sides involved agreed to disengage their forces. Later, Nixon became the first president to tour the Middle East in June 1974, just 2 months before he resigned. Anwar Sadat did the unthinkable and visited Israel in 1977. And in 1978, Egypt and Israel officially normalized relations through the Camp David Accords. I was proud to be part of the Nixon administration. We made the world safer and more peaceful. We ended the Vietnam War and brought the POWs home. We opened China and transformed the global landscape. We limited stockpiles of nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union and stabilized our relations. And we set the stage for the Middle East peace process. Through these diplomatic triumphs, Nixon restored American credibility as a global leader, rather than being bogged down in a war and domestic turmoil. And he lifted the spirits of the American people who had been demoralized by a turbulent decade. I am Ambassador Winston Lord, and thank you for watching.
All right, so Richard Nixon, while we say use the term open China to the US, and then this idea of the one China policy, that there would be recognized, the US would recognize Beijing as the government of China and that Taiwan would be considered part of China. However, the US also insisted that it would defend Taiwan and that any reapproachment between Taiwan and China needed to be done peacefully. So, my line. We've also mentioned the Kent State Massacre of 1970. Kent State, of course, a university. There was an anti-war protest going on. The governor, along with the university administration, decided they didn't want things to get out of hand, so they asked that the National Guard, the state militia, basically, step in and kind of control the situation. But as you can see, they didn't control the situation. They basically killed 4 young people, 4 protesters. And that picture here to the right, very famous picture, was in all of the newspapers and magazines. So here we have military members shooting at unarmed civilian protesters, college students.
What happened here at Kent State University 50 years ago defined an age.
The guardsmen opened fire on the students.
67 shots. At an anti-Vietnam War protest, 4 dead, 9 injured.
I've never been able to just completely forget it.
Student photographer Howard Ruffner was on the Hill that day. His pictures soon appeared in Life magazine, including this dramatic cover.
I didn't know if he was alive or dead. And you look at him, he doesn't look like he's going to live.
The young man fighting for his life, freshman John Cleary, was shot walking to class.
I was shot in the chest, 1 or 2 inches in one direction. I wouldn't be here.
Events that penned an anthem by singer Neil Young. Polls at the time showed most Americans blamed the demonstrators, not the Guard.
It's such a juxtaposition.
John Cleary has spent his life moving beyond it.
It's a snapshot of one moment of time, and I didn't want that to define me.
Today on campus, scars, bullet holes, markers for the dead.
How do you feel standing here now, looking at this spot?
I get shivers.
As Kent State prepares to mark the anniversary, Howard and John meet for the first time.
Pleasure to finally meet you, because
it really is.
New bonds from the darkest of days. Kevin Tibbles, NBC News, Kent State University.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking in.
So 4 dead, 2 young women, 2 young men, 9 wounded. And why did they fire? I mean, there've been investigations and that. A lot of unfortunate things all led into that, as well as the probably poor training that the military members had received getting ready for these sorts of operations. And I don't know, ironically, but a lot of the ones who were wounded and that weren't even protesting, like the one fellow you heard, he was just walking to class and he happened to get caught in the fire. And then we mentioned the evacuation of Saigon, 1975. The United States Embassy was closing. The Vietnamese, North Vietnamese were invading, had taken over Saigon. And so there were going to be a series of helicopters taking, originally it was just supposed to be the last people who were at the embassy, but South Vietnamese who wanted to escape the country tried to get onto the helicopters as well. It was basically chaos. They were trying to get out to ships off the coast of Vietnam that were there. They were U.S. ships that were going to be taking people to the United States. And here's the fall of Saigon.
Saigon, April the 30th, 8 o'clock. The last American helicopter on the roof of the American embassy prepares to lift off the last of the evacuees fleeing before the advancing communist armies. Back in the city, normal patterns of behavior broke down. In a climate of every man for himself, American homes, offices and stores were looted of everything. The discarded equipment even ran to tanks, some damaged, but some also abandoned intact by their crews as they fled before the communists. And then, shortly after midday, came the climax of 30 years of fighting. The first North Vietnamese troops entered the city, packed into trucks that flew the red and blue flag of the Communist Provisional Revolutionary Government, the PRG. Those who failed on that last day to get a place on the helicopters and who had reason to fear the communist takeover made for the only route that still offered a chance of escape, the Saigon River. Hundreds scrambled in panic onto any boats they could reach, not caring how they got aboard or what they left behind.
And that was that. Okay, now the fall of the liberal consensus.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to Nixon! We're going to talk about the rise of conservatism. So Alabama, where I went to high school, is a pretty conservative state and reliably sends Republicans to Washington. Like both of its senators, Jeff Sessions and Richard Shelby, are Republicans. But did you know that Richard Shelby used to be a Democrat? Just like basically all of Alabama's senators since Reconstruction. And this shift from Democrat to Republican throughout the South is the result of the rise of conservative politics in the 1960s and 1970s that we are going to talk about today. And along the way, we get to put Richard Nixon's head in a jar. Stan just informed me that we don't actually get to put Richard Nixon's head in a jar. It's just a Futurama joke, and now I'm sad. So you'll remember from our last episode that we learned that not everyone in the 1960s was a psychedelic, rock-listening, war-protesting hippie. In fact, there was a strong undercurrent current of conservative thinking that ran throughout the 1960s, even among young people. And one aspect of this was the rise of free market ideology and libertarianism. Like, since the 1950s, a majority of Americans had broadly agreed that free enterprise was a good thing and should be encouraged both in the US and abroad.
Mr. Green! And also in deep space where no man has gone before?
No, me from the past. You're thinking of the Starship Enterprise, not free enterprise. And anyway, me from the past, have you ever seen a more aggressively communist television program than The Neutral Zone from Star Trek The Next Generation's first season? I don't think so. All right, so in the 1950s, a growing number of libertarians argued that unregulated capitalism and individual autonomy were the essence of American freedom. And although they were staunchly anti-communist, their real target was the regulatory state that had been created by the New Deal. You know, Social Security and not being allowed to, you know, choose how many pigs you kill, etc. Other conservatives weren't libertarians at all, but moral conservatives who were okay with the rules that enforced traditional notions of family and morality, even if that seemed like, you know, an oppressive government. For them, virtue was the essence of America. But both of these strands of conservatism were very hostile toward communism and also to the idea of big government. And it's worth noting that since World War I, the size and scope of the federal government had increased dramatically. And hostility toward the idea of big government remains the signal feature of contemporary conservatism, although very few people actually argue for shrinking the government because, you know, that would be very unpopular. People like Medicare. But it was faith in the free market that infused the ideology of the most vocal young conservatives in the 1960s. They didn't receive nearly as much press as their liberal counterparts, but these young conservatives played a pivotal role in reshaping the Republican Party, especially in the election of 1964. The 1964 presidential election was important in American history precisely because it was so incredibly uncompetitive. I mean, Lyndon Johnson was carrying the torch of a wildly popular American president who had been assassinated a few months before. He was never going to lose. And indeed, he didn't. The Republican candidate, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, was demolished by LBJ. But the mere fact of Goldwater's nomination was a huge conservative victory. I mean, he beat out liberal Republican New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and yes, there were liberal Republicans. Goldwater demanded a harder line in the Cold War, even suggesting that nuclear war might be an option in the fight against communism, and he lambasted the New Deal liberal welfare state for destroying American initiative and individual liberty. I mean, why bother working when you can just enjoy life on the dole? I mean, unemployment insurance allowed anyone in America to become a hundredaire. But it was his stance on the Cold War that doomed his candidacy. In his acceptance speech, Goldwater famously declared, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice," which made it really easy for Johnson to paint Goldwater as an extremist. In the famous Daisy advertisement, Johnson supporters countered Goldwater's campaign slogan of "In your heart, you know he's right," with "But in your guts, you know he's nuts." So in the end, Goldwater received a paltry 27 million votes to Johnson's 43 million, and Democrats racked up huge majorities in both houses of Congress. This hides, however, the significance of the election. 5 of the 6 states that Goldwater carried were in the Deep South, which had been reliably Democratic, known as the Solid South, in fact. Now, it's too simple to say that race alone led to the shift from Democratic to the Republican Party in the South, because Goldwater didn't really talk much about race. But the Democrats, especially under LBJ, became the party associated with defending civil rights and ending segregation, and that definitely played a role in white Southerners abandoning the Democratic Party, as was demonstrated even more clearly in the 1968 election. The election of 1968 was a real cluster Calhoun. I mean, there were riots, and there was also the nomination of Hubert Humphrey, who was very unpopular with the anti-war movement and also was named Hubert Humphrey, and that's just what happened with the Democrats. But lost in that picture was the Republican nominee, Richard Milhous Nixon, who was one of the few candidates in American history to come back and win the presidency after losing in a previous election. How'd he do it? Well, it probably wasn't his charm, but it might have been his patience. Nixon was famous for his ability to sit and wait in poker games. It made him very successful during his tour of duty in the South Pacific. In fact, he earned the nickname Old Iron Butt. Plus, he was anti-communist but didn't talk a lot about nuking people, and the clincher was probably that he was from California, which by the late 1960s was becoming the most populous state in the nation. Nixon won the election campaigning as the candidate of the silent majority of Americans who weren't anti-war protesters and who didn't admire free love or the communal ideas of hippies, and who were alarmed at the rights that the Supreme Court court seemed to be expanding, especially for criminals. This silent majority felt that the rights revolution had gone too far. I mean, they were concerned about the breakdown in traditional values and in law and order. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. Nixon also promised to be tough on crime, which was coded language to whites in the South that he wouldn't support civil rights protests. The equation of crime with African Americans has a long and sordid history in the United States, and Nixon played it up following a Southern strategy to further draw white Democrats who favored segregation into the Republican ranks. Now, Nixon only won 43% of the vote, but if you've paid attention to American history, you know that you ain't gotta win a majority to be the president. He was denied that majority primarily by Alabama Governor George Wallace, who was running on a pro-segregation ticket and won 13% of the vote. So 56% of American voters chose candidates who were either explicitly or quietly against civil rights. Conservatives who voted for Nixon hoping that he would roll back the New Deal were disappointed. I mean, in some ways, the Nixon domestic agenda was just a continuation of LBJ's Great Society. This was partly because Congress was still in the hands of Democrats, but also Nixon didn't push for conservative programs, and he didn't veto new initiatives because they were popular. And he liked to be popular. So in fact, a number of big government liberal programs began under Nixon. I mean, the environmental movement achieved success with the enactment of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. The Occupational Health and Safety Administration and the National Transportation Safety Board were created to make new regulations that would protect worker safety and make cars safer. That's not government getting out of our lives, that's government getting into our cars. And when Nixon had the opportunity to nominate a new Chief Justice to the Supreme Court after Earl Warren retired in 1969, his choice, Warren Burger, was supposed to be a supporter of small government and conservative ideals, but just like Nixon, he proved a disappointment in that regard. Like in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, the court upheld a lower court ruling that required busing of students to achieve integration in Charlotte's schools. And then the Burger Court made it easier for minorities to sue for employment discrimination, especially with its ruling in Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. This upheld affirmative action as a valid governmental interest, although it did strike down the use of strict quotas in university admissions. Now, many conservatives didn't like these affirmative action decisions, but one case above all others had a profound effect on American politics. Roe versus Wade. Roe v. Wade established a woman's right to have an abortion in the first trimester of a pregnancy, as well as a more limited right as the pregnancy progressed. And that decision galvanized first Catholics and then evangelical Protestants. And that ties in nicely with another strand in American conservatism that developed in the 1960s and 1970s. Let's go to the thought bubble. Many Americans felt that traditional family values were deteriorating and looked to conservative Republican candidates to stop that slide. They were particularly alarmed by the continuing success of the sexual revolution as symbolized by Roe v. Wade and the increasing availability of birth control. Statistics tend to back up the claims that traditional family values were in decline in the 1970s, like the number of divorces soared to over 1 million in 1975, exceeding the number of first-time marriages. The birth rate declined, with women bearing 1.7 children during their lifetimes by 1976, less than half the figure in 1957. Now, of course, many people would argue that the decline of these traditional values allowed more freedom for women and for a lot of terrible marriages to end, but that's neither here nor there. Some conservatives also complained about the passage in 1972 of Title IX, which banned gender discrimination in higher education, but many more expressed concern about the increasing number of women in the workforce. Like by 1980, 40% of women with young children had been in the workforce, up from 20% in 1960. The backlash against increased opportunity for women is most obviously seen in the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1974, although it passed Congress easily in 1972. Opponents of the ERA, which rather innocuously declared that equality of rights under the law could not be abridged on account of sex, argued that the ERA would let men off the hook for providing for their wives and children, and that working women would lead to the further breakdown of the family. Again, all the ERA stated was that women and men would have equal rights under the laws of the United States. But anyway, some anti-ERA supporters, like Phyllis Schlafly, claim that free enterprise was the greatest liberator of women because the purchase of new labor-saving devices would offer them genuine freedom in their traditional roles of wife and mother. Essentially, the vacuum cleaner shall make you free, and those arguments were persuasive to enough people that the ERA was not ratified in the required 3/4 of the United States. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Sorry if I let my personal feelings get in the way on that one. Anyway, Nixon didn't have much to do with the continuing sexual revolution. It would have continued without him because, you know, scootily pooping is popular. But he was successfully re-elected in 1972, partly because his opponent was the Democratic Barry Goldwater, George McGovern. McGovern only carried one state, and it wasn't even his home state. It was Massachusetts, of course. But even though they couldn't possibly lose, Nixon's campaign decided to cheat. In June of 1972, people from Nixon's campaign broke into McGovern's campaign office, possibly to plant bugs. Now, we don't know if Nixon actually knew about the activities of the former employees of the amazingly acronymed CREEP, that is the Committee for the Re-election of the President. But this break-in at the Watergate Hotel eventually led to Nixon being the first and so far only American president to resign. What we do know is this: Nixon was really paranoid about his opponents, even the ones who appealed to 12% of American voters, especially after Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times in 1971. So he drew up an enemies list and created a special investigative unit called the Plumbers, whose job was to fix toilets. No, it was to stop leaks. That makes more sense. I'm sorry, Stan, it's just by then the toilets in the White House were over 100 years old. I figured they might need some fixing, but apparently no. It was leaking. So what ultimately doomed Nixon was not the break-in itself, but the revelations that he covered it up by authorizing hush money payments to keep the burglars silent and also instructing the FBI not to investigate the crime. In August of 1974, the House Judiciary Committee recommended that articles of impeachment be drawn up against Nixon for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, but the real crime ultimately was abuse of power, and there's really no question about whether he was guilty of that. So Nixon resigned. Aw, man, I was thinking I was going to get away without a mystery document today. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, and lately I'm never wrong. All right. Today I am an inquisitor. I believe hyperbole would not be fictional and would not overstate the solemnness that I feel right now. My faith in the Constitution is whole, it is complete, it is total. I am not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution. Oh, I'm gonna get shocked today. Is it Sam Ervin? Oh, dang it! Apparently it was African-American Congresswoman from Texas, Barbara Jordan. Stan, that is much too hard. I think you were getting tired of me not being shocked, Stan, because it's pretty strange to end an episode on conservatism with a quote from Barbara Jordan, whose election to Congress has to be seen as a huge victory for liberalism. But I guess it is symbolic of the very things that many conservatives found unsettling in the 1970s, including political and economic success for African-Americans and women and the legislation that helped the marginalized. Now, I know that sounds very judgmental, but on the other hand, the federal government had become a huge part of every American's life, maybe too huge. And certainly conservatives weren't wrong when they said that the founding fathers of the U.S. would hardly recognize the nation that we had become by the 1970s. In fact, Watergate was followed by a Senate investigation by the Church Committee, which revealed that Nixon was hardly the first president to abuse his power. The government had spied on Americans throughout the Cold War and tried to disrupt the civil rights movement, and the Church Commission, Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, Vietnam, all of these things revealed a government that truly was out of control, and this undermined a fundamental liberal belief that government is a good institution that is supposed to solve problems and promote freedom. And for many conservatives, these scandals sent a clear signal that government couldn't promote freedom and couldn't solve problems, and that the liberal government of the New Deal and the Great Society had to be stopped. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
All right. Pretty good introduction, covered a lot. Liberal consensus, the new right, stagflation, the crisis of confidence, Reaganomics, and the emergence of neoliberalism. And be cautious with that. When we say neoliberalism, don't think of it as in liberal, like social liberals who want freedom for everyone and this, that, and the other thing. It's a different situation. It's actually conservative, okay? Neoliberalism is conservative. I know that seems a little confusing, but a lot of this is because of terminology it's used in Europe that we've adopted in the United States. So liberal consensus, acceptance of greater role of government in regulating the economy, that the government was seen as a power that needed to be utilized to help control the economy. The U.S. had expanded, its economy was enormous, it was a world power. We were not, it's true, we would not have been recognized by our founding fathers because they could not have probably imagined what we'd become. But the government was accepted as needing to be involved in the economy, the running of the economy, regulation, etc. The war on poverty, that was part of the Lyndon Johnson administration. Trying urban redevelopment, getting rid of slums, trying to bring about, safety in the cities, public housing for people, job training, food stamps. so that no one starves, and also early childhood education. This would be before elementary school, like nursery schools and that, providing that opportunity, especially for low-income families, and medical care for the poor and the old age. This would be Medicare. 1960s to 70s, second wave feminism, we call that. We had feminism in the 19-teens that culminated in the women getting the right to vote in 1920. The second wave feminism, women's rights, National Organization for Women Now, the Equal Pay Act, 1963, increase in women's groups and women in politics. We also had Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion nationwide in 1973, and then now that was overturned by a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. We sometimes think rights are forever once they are granted, but you have to be cautious. A right granted can also be taken away. Always must you be vigilant. In the 1960s, the rise of the new right, we'll call that. There had been a right that had traditionally been more of an economic conservatism. We'd also see kind of a social conservatism that would come out of this era. People who were concerned about the breakdown of the nuclear family, people concerned about women in getting employment, all sorts of things that people were social conservatives. This would also lead to the religious evangelicals becoming involved in politics, especially with the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. Barry Goldwater won the Republican nomination, 1964. He was a senator from Arizona, and I lived in Arizona from 1988 to 2000. I taught there, I went to university there, got my doctorate there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Barry Goldwater, the Goldwaters were a long-established political force in Arizona. He was a hyper-conservative, Barry Goldwater, and he made statements to the fact that he felt, for example, nuclear war was actually not something that should be ignored as a possible option in the Cold War. I mean, he kind of frightened a lot of people with this, and it showed in the election itself. Lyndon Johnson won in a landslide in 1964. 1968, 4 years later, Richard Nixon was elected president. The Vietnam War had really turned people against the Democratic power structure, against Lyndon Johnson, and then his vice president was running. Lyndon Johnson actually would decide not to run for re-election. He knew that he could not carry the day. Hubert Humphrey, who had been his vice president, was running instead. Bobby Kennedy was jumping into the campaign. Bobby Kennedy would be assassinated. Had Bobby Kennedy stayed in, if he had actually not been assassinated, who knows? He might have been able to been elected. We would not have had a Nixon administration. Who knows? I mean, these events, one individual, one handgun, history has changed. The Democratic Party's support for civil rights after 1964 to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 alienated white Southern voters. So this was what we talked about, the Southern strategy. Nixon was attempting to get these Southern voters who were tendency to see the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, is doing something to quote unquote white power in the South. And so Nixon attempted through coded language to attract them to the Republican Party, talking about, that law and order and war against drugs and this and that, the other thing. And so the transfer of the Solid South from Democrat to Republican, traditionally, since 1968, I should say, the South is seen as a solidly Republican set of states, that they tend to vote Republican for governorships, for their state legislatures, etc. Then we had, of course, the Watergate scandal. Nixon easily won re-election, 1972. But Nixon, as we know, was highly paranoid and suspicious, and he didn't want to book any chance that he wasn't going to get reelected. So this committee for the reelection of the president, CREEP, they basically were involved in nefarious activities, not just the Watergate break-in, other things that they did, but the Watergate break-in and the fact that the people who were breaking into the Watergate hotel complex and trying to get into the Democratic offices there of the Democratic campaign, they were caught. And then word got out that they were working for this organization, CREEP. And then really what got Nixon into trouble was he ordered a cover up of this. It would have been very different probably if he'd actually gone on, maybe even television or something, and said, listen, this occurred. He could have claimed I didn't really know about it. These actors were acting on behalf of this organization supporting my reelection, but I disown them. I mean, there would have probably been some fallout anyway, but it would not have probably led to his needing to resign from the White House, from the presidency, because he was under threat of impeachment at that point, and only one president had ever been impeached. That would take us all the way back to the just after the Civil War. So it was a big thing to get impeached. And then Nixon also was told, even if you are impeached, you will probably be convicted, because it's basically impeachment as you're indicted for something. And then there's basically a court trial in the Senate. So Nixon resigned, and he made an agreement with Gerald Ford, who had become vice president when Nixon's original vice president had to resign, and that he would get a pardon, and he did get a pardon from Ford, and that probably cost Ford election in 1976. Stagflation, think of inflation, but consider it, times 500. That's stagflation, where the price of goods and that just skyrockets, especially gasoline prices, fuel, that sort of thing. And the crisis of confidence. So the 1970s, U.S. economy suffered from a lot of structural weaknesses. We were moving from an industrial base to something else. And so by 1971, around the first trade deficit since the 1930s, there was decline in manufacturing and exports. I remember that my town had one industry. We were mostly an agricultural town, but we had one industry. During the war, it made tanks and tank parts. During the peacetime, it made tractors and such. But the company actually had to close the plant, and they moved down south. That happened a lot. In fact, that would cause the area I grew up in, and just south where I grew up, was called the Rust Belt, because of all these companies that were closed up and moved elsewhere, sometimes to Mexico and overseas. And then 1973, OPEC, Organization of Oil Petroleum Exporting Countries, response to the U.S. support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, where the Israelis, due in no small part to American support, were able to kind of basically stop an attacks by Syria and by Egypt. And so in reaction to that, the Middle East oil producing countries basically did a kind of a embargo, basically. So oil became something that was inexpensive, became something incredibly expensive. The US couldn't make enough, couldn't get enough gas. I remember there were, like, for example, huge traffic jams trying to get to gas stations that still had gasoline to sell. And of course, the price of gas skyrocketed. Stagflation, economic stagnation, and currency inflation characterized the 1970s. It was a tough time in the U.S. The economies were changing. For lack of a better way to phrase it, the loss of the Vietnam War was a crisis of confidence. Things were disruptive. They had been in the 60s, 70s, and so a lot of people were questioning what happens next. Well, then Ronald Reagan showed up, Okay, he was a neoconservative. He was a very conservative person. He'd been a Democrat years before, and he always said that I didn't leave the Democratic Party, it left me. He had become, he was an actor originally. He had been president of the Screen Actors Guild. He ran for and won the governorship of California. And as I mentioned in class, California is a huge state with a huge economy. I think it's right now, if it was a country, it would have the 6th largest economy in the world. So he had 2 terms in office as governor of California. And he challenged in 1976 he wanted to become the Republican nominee for the presidency for the election. Gerald Ford, however, won, and then Ronald Reagan kind of bad his time, and by 1980 he ran again and won. So economic neoliberalism emphasized free trade, reduction in regulations of business and markets, privatization of resources, whether that be water, air power, and all sorts of things. Basically, moving things that were traditionally controlled by the government into the private sector and public services. Social conservatism would be very important during this era, and even now, to be honest. Religiously influenced opposition to women's and minority rights, aspects of social welfare, all of that would be part of it. We would see evangelical Christians become very involved in the Republican Party, and they still are. Reaganomics, neoliberal economic reforms and tax cuts for wealthy. This is where we get trickle down economics. The idea is if you give tax cuts to the super wealthy, then they will spend their money and the benefits will trickle down through the middle class and lower classes. That's never worked. The top tax bracket at a beginning was 70%. So you could be taxed up to 70% of your income. And they changed it to 28%. Now in the US, you get taxed typically by the federal government, but also you pay state and local taxes. Not all states have state taxes. For example, Florida doesn't have state taxes. Texas doesn't have state taxes. Nevada doesn't. Alaska, why? Well, in Florida, tourism brings in enough money that the government doesn't need to actually have an income tax. Nevada, the same thing, gambling and tourism. But in Texas, for example, it's because of oil. They make enough money from oil and that industry. They don't need to feel they need to have a state tax. Same thing in Alaska. It doesn't mean that you might not have to pay like local property taxes and things like that for your city, but that's it. So, the typical American middle class person is going to probably pay about 35 to 40% of their income in taxes. And then if we put in other things like Social Security and this and that, it can go up to about 50% easily. But the federal tax rate in this case dropped from 70% to 28%, benefiting generally the wealthy. And you can see U.S. manufacturing jobs from 1980 to 2014 dropped. All right. Now, manufacturing is making a bit of a comeback, but it definitely was a situation where factories were closing in the U.S., moving overseas to developing countries, to Mexico, or China's, industrial complex would be picked up, and U.S. companies be associated with, Chinese manufacturing. And share of total income going to the top 10% from 1917 to 2007. So you can kind of see, okay, the top 10% would be the top 10% economically of the country, the citizens who had the most money, the top 10%. And you can see that, okay, we saw kind of a large amount of the wealth was controlled just after 1927. So, right before the stock market crash, 1929, it reached total income going to the 10%. It was almost 50%. Now we've actually got back up to that by about 2007, that the upper 10% controls, upwards of 50% of the income in the United States. So 10% get 50% of the income. Gives you an idea of wealth inequality. All right. That is that. Anyway, you'll watch this, you'll be ready for the essay test coming up. Yes, there will be some questions that you would be able to use the information I've shared today. And you will have access, of course, PowerPoint of this presentation. You can use that